In part 4 of this video series, we're going to talk about adapting to climate change. In the last video, we talked about mitigating, and I left you with this question at the end: what if we don't mitigate, or what if we don't mitigate in time? And this is kind of a trick question because we already aren't mitigating in time. We're already well behind what we needed to be doing in order to avoid the worst of the climate impacts. But the answer to this question, which you probably already know, is that we adapt. Climate adaptation is sort of the counterpart to mitigation. Mitigation is reducing carbon emissions or pulling carbon out of the air to limit climate change generally. Adapting to climate change means knowing that impacts are coming regardless of how much we mitigate and being ready for those impacts. Climate adaptation was not as big of a conversation even 6 years ago when I started teaching about climate change at the university. The focus was very much on on mitigating, and then, the assumption that we'll have to adapt, if things don't go the right way. Now adaptation is as big of a conversation, if not bigger, than mitigation. And the good news is we already are adapting. This is something that humans tend to do pretty well, is react to things that are happening, or at least to respond. So if you think back to these impacts we talked about in the impact video in part 2, we talked about how these different impacts kind of all start depending on when we hit a certain temperature rise. This is a little bit older of a chart. Actually, a lot of these arrows should be pushed up a little bit towards the lower climate or lower temperature areas, because we're hitting these sooner than we thought we would. You could ignore these red models here. Those are just the climate projection models, the RCP scenarios. So, coral reef ecosystems extensively and irreversibly damaged. We are actually already trying to respond to this. We're trying to adapt to this. Severe impacts in the marginal Sahel. We're already trying to alleviate some of those food impacts. All of these are starting to either happen in some way or are at least coming across our radar, and we're thinking about how to adapt to them ahead of time. But climate adaptation, if you want a definition of it, presenting or minimizing the damage caused by climate change, or potentially taking advantage of opportunities that arise. The poster child for this would be a seawall. We know that sea level rise is coming. And so to protect coastal cities or coastal property, we might build a seawall in order to block some of that flooding damage or storm surge damage. Other adaptation things you might think of, air filters. This is something that we do a lot of in Missoula because the smoke gets so bad in the summer and the fall. And wildfire smoke causes a lot of respiratory illness or exacerbates existing respiratory illness. And so a local organization in partnership with the city subsidizes and tries to do some education on air filtration and the effects of wildfire smoke on your lungs. This is something that's only going to get worse. And so that adaptation is sort of having to perpetuate itself and get bigger and bigger each year. But the result is that a lot of people in Missoula now have access to filters. And if they can't afford the store-bought ones, that organization puts together their own DIY filters and tries to get those out to people. We know climate change is going to create greater human migration and climate refugees. So a few countries are starting to at least think about how to revise their refugee policies to allow for people fleeing climate disasters, or in some extreme cases, loss of their entire country. And on and on. You could think of lots of examples that count as climate adaptation. Basically, anything you do in response to climate change as it happens is a climate adaptation. But I do want to introduce kind of an additional concept here, which is the idea of deep adaptation. And that means preparing for climate eventualities well in advance, or even taking advantage of what you know to be a climate adaptation or a climate eventuality. So some things you might think about. We know that sea level is rising, so instead of just building seawalls across our entire coast, how can we start to move people back inland? As people are moving, switching properties, as the opportunity arises, Can we incentivize people to move away from the coast so that we minimize that damage? And by the time the sea level would normally impact that coastline, those people are already well away. That would be a deep adaptation. Having a resilient grid. This would be a deep adaptation in the sense that we know our grid is going to be, kind of at the forefront of climate damage. It's going to be very susceptible to a lot of the changes that climate change is going to bring. So could we in advance create a grid that is more resilient, that has more local sustainability and is more adaptable as natural disasters and things happen around it? That would have been a deep adaptation, except that's already happening to our grid. The example being Texas this past winter got knocked out by a cold spell that knocked out their natural gas infrastructure. And so they were out of power for days. So now at this point, that's just an adaptation. We could protect pollinators. We know that our food security will be at risk. And we know that the ecosystems that pollinators depend on will also be at risk. And so could we put in systems now to protect pollinators so that they can be there for our food security in the future? We know that there will be scarcity in the future due to climate change. So can we prepare now by reducing or changing our consumption habits and focusing people's attention on sort of a scarcity mindset? Freshwater conservation. We know freshwater is going to be under threat, partly because of drought conditions in inland areas and from saltwater inundation in coastal areas. The poster child for this is the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, which is this huge freshwater resource that feeds this huge agricultural area that is all of southern Vietnam, that supplies much of the food to all of Southeast Asia. And because of sea level rise and because of dams upriver of the Delta, the Mekong Delta is losing more and more ground every year to salt water coming in from the sea. So that's a huge part of their water and food security. How can we think about conserving freshwater resources now rather than waiting for it to become a disaster in the future? You could keep going. Epidemiological studies. We know vector-borne diseases are going to spread. And vectors will have habitat in places they hadn't previously had habitat. So can we do those studies now to prepare for those diseases and to prepare health, wow, it's hard to talk today, and to prepare health professionals to be ready to diagnose and recognize those diseases as they arrive. And you could keep going on with this. To relate this to COVID again, like I did a couple of videos past, we are adapting to COVID. We have been since it arrived. We started wearing masks. We shut down schools and universities. We sent everyone online. We did social distancing. We reduced public events. Eventually we had diagnostic tests, and eventually we had a vaccine. All of these are adaptations to a virus. So I want you to imagine, what would a deep adaptation to a virus pandemic look like? What if we knew COVID was coming 2 years from now? What systems would we put in place now so that we would be better prepared for the virus when it arrived? And I realized we did have systems in place that were undone, some didn't work. So there was some deep adaptation trying to be done by the previous administration and previous health officials. But I just want you to imagine, like, what would a deep adaptation have looked like with COVID? And can we apply that same mentality to a deep adaptation for climate change? There are other adaptations to make that aren't just responding to the physical nature of climate change. And one of the biggest is more of a social adaptation. The climate movement has long been focused on sort of the traditional environmental movement rhetoric about protecting ecosystems, protecting health. And in recent years, it's really taken a shift, largely led by youth, as more of a justice movement. And lately, that's almost all you hear about the climate movement in terms of is as a climate justice movement. And if you think about all the social justice issues we have in the country and around the world, none of them is immune from climate change, and climate change action depends on justice. So if you think of racial justice, gender justice, sexual justice, all these things, they're all interrelated with climate change, and all those movements in many ways need each other to move forward together. So it helps to rethink the climate movement as a justice movement and any climate action as a justice action. And you can think about it the other way as well. If you are involved in social justice, you are working towards climate justice as well. Because climate change is a distributive justice issue in the sense that the places and people that have contributed the most to climate change and reaped the most rewards from burning fossil fuels are not the same people who are feeling the biggest effects of climate change and who did not reap the awards of burning fossil fuels. So there's a distributive injustice going on there. There's also a procedural injustice in the sense that the most powerful countries, the ones who get to drive the conversation on climate change, are also the ones who stand to gain the most from burning fossil fuels. And so it's a little bit of a fox guarding the henhouse type of situation. So that's a procedural justice issue. And then, as we've talked about already, it's an intergenerational justice issue. The generation that has the most power and the most wealth and is the most responsible for climate change is also the generation that will feel the effects the least. And the generation that will feel the most effects has the least power to respond to it currently. And the last adaptation I want to bring up is personal adaptation. How do we prepare ourselves as individuals mentally and emotionally for a crisis? And this is what I want to get to in the last video, because this is where my videos up to this point have not been the right approach. I've given you the doom and gloom. I've given you the guilt and the shame of your climate responsibility. But how do you mentally and emotionally take all that in and actually turn that into action? And it gets more complicated than it feels like it should be. But that's what we're going to get to in the last video. So I will see you there.